She said it like she was commenting on the weather, like it was a fact so settled it didn't deserve a tone shift or a pause, and the moment the words, "guys and girls can be just friends," landed between us, I felt something quiet and final click into place inside my chest. Not anger yet, but recognition. The kind that comes when you realize the conversation you thought you were having is not the conversation the other person showed up for. We were standing in the kitchen, late enough that the apartment had that hollow nighttime echo, the hum of the fridge filling the gaps between sentences, and I had just asked what I thought was a reasonable question about why her phone kept lighting up during dinner with his name, the same name that had started appearing everywhere like a watermark I couldn't scrub out. And she leaned back against the counter with her arms crossed, calm in a way that felt practiced, and said, "I don't understand why you keep circling this, because guys and girls can be just friends, and it's honestly exhausting having to reassure you about something that isn't happening." I remember the exact way she looked at me when she said it, not defensive or flustered, but patient, almost indulgent, like I was a child she was explaining gravity to, and I realized she wasn't trying to convince me of anything so much as she was closing a door, because reassurance sounds like empathy, but what she was offering was a verdict. I tried to explain how it felt from my side, how it wasn't about jealousy, but about space, about how intimacy leaks when you're not paying attention. And she interrupted me with a sigh that carried weeks of irritation, telling me that she refused to shrink her world to manage my insecurities, that she'd had male friends her whole life, that nothing about this was new except my sudden fixation, and the way she said sudden made it clear she thought this was a flaw that had just surfaced in me rather than something her behavior had invited. The thing that hit hardest wasn't even his name, which she dropped casually like it deserved to be familiar to me, but the way she framed my discomfort as an inconvenience, because once someone decides your feelings are a logistical problem instead of information, you've already lost the argument even if you're technically right. I remember saying, slowly and carefully, that I wasn't asking her to cut anyone off, that I just wanted to understand where I fit when so much emotional energy was being spent elsewhere, and she laughed softly, not cruelly but confidently, and told me that love wasn't a limited resource, and that I should be proud she had someone she trusted so deeply, because that meant she was healthy and secure. And the irony of her saying secure while I felt myself sliding out of my own place wasn't lost on me. That was the moment I stopped trying to win, because it became painfully obvious that this wasn't about boundaries or compromise or even sex, but about permission, about her wanting the freedom to keep something that made her feel wanted without having to negotiate the cost, and the calmness in her voice told me she'd already decided that whatever damage it caused was acceptable collateral. I nodded like I understood, like I was absorbing a lesson rather than swallowing a dismissal, and she softened immediately, stepping closer and touching my arm, telling me she loved me and that I was overthinking, and there was something almost cruel about the tenderness that followed, because it felt like a reward for compliance rather than care. Later that night, lying next to her while she slept easily, her phone face down on the nightstand after one last buzz she pretended not to notice, I stared at the ceiling and replayed the conversation until the meaning stripped itself bare, and what I finally understood was that she wasn't asking me to trust her. She was asking me to accept a structure where my discomfort would always come second to her comfort, and once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. I didn't feel the urge to yell or accuse or storm out, because something colder and steadier had taken its place, a kind of clarity that comes when you stop trying to be chosen and start paying attention to the rules of the game you're already in. And that was the night I realized that if guys and girls could just be friends, then so could I. And if this was normal, then symmetry was fair, and fairness has a way of revealing truths that arguments never touch. I didn't start noticing him more because I was looking for proof. Because once you decide to look for proof, you're already admitting you don't trust your own instincts. And what actually happened was subtler and worse, because he just kept appearing without effort, threaded into her life so seamlessly that I felt stupid for not seeing it earlier. His name popped up in casual anecdotes about work stress, in jokes she'd half repeat without context, in the way she smiled at her phone, and then immediately locked it when I glanced over, not guilty exactly, but protective, like whatever lived in that screen belonged to her and not to us. I'd ask how her day was and she'd tell me, but the emotional weight of it felt edited, like the raw version had already been given to someone else, and what I got was a summary stripped of urgency, because urgency had already been spent elsewhere. It crept into our evenings too, into the quiet rituals that used to feel intimate, because when we sat on the couch and watched something mindless, she'd still lean against me, still let my hand rest on her thigh, but her attention fractured more easily, drifting toward that familiar buzz, and every time she excused herself to reply quickly, I felt the same dull pinch, not sharp enough to call pain, but persistent enough to wear me down. When I finally asked, gently, why he seemed to know about her bad days before I did, she didn't hesitate, didn't even flinch, just told me that he was good at listening and that it was nice to have someone who understood her without making it a whole thing. And the way she emphasized whole thing made it clear she meant me. She said it wasn't fair to police who she leaned on, that emotional support wasn't a finite resource, and as she spoke I realized how carefully she'd learned to frame this, because every word positioned me as unreasonable without her ever having to say it out loud. The worst part wasn't suspicion of sex, because my imagination never went that far. Not really. But the slow recognition that something more corrosive was happening. Something quieter. Because intimacy isn't just bodies and orgasms, but attention and timing, and being the first person someone wants, when something good or bad happens. I started noticing that when she laughed hard at something on her phone, the kind of laugh that pulls from the chest, she didn't look at me afterward to share it, and when something upset her, she'd already processed it by the time we talked, leaving me with the aftermath instead of the moment, and I understood then that the betrayal wasn't an affair, but a replacement, because the role I used to play hadn't disappeared. It had just been filled by someone else who didn't have to negotiate space with me. When I tried to articulate this, carefully choosing words that didn't sound like accusation, she grew distant in a way that felt rehearsed, telling me I was reading into things, that I was projecting past baggage, that my fixation was the real problem, and hearing myself framed as irrational over and over began to erode something fundamental, because once your partner decides your perception is unreliable, you're forced to either doubt yourself or accept a reality that doesn't feel true. I lay awake more nights than I want to admit, replaying conversations, feeling the ache of wanting her attention while she lay inches away, warm and familiar and oddly unreachable. And somewhere in that quiet I realized that I wasn't losing her to another man in some dramatic way, but to the idea that she didn't owe me exclusivity where it mattered most, and that understanding settled into me slowly, heavy and undeniable, like a truth I could no longer afford to ignore. I stopped trying to argue because arguing kept me trapped in her frame, reacting to her rules, and instead I went quiet in a way that felt unnatural at first, like holding my breath underwater, because silence is only powerful when the other person expects noise. I started saying yes more often, not eagerly but neutrally, nodding when she mentioned his name, asking polite follow-up questions that surprised her because they sounded like acceptance, and somewhere in that shift I felt my own spine straighten, because detachment creates space to think. The idea didn't come to me as revenge at first, because revenge implies heat, and what I felt was cool and methodical, a desire to understand the structure of what she'd normalized by recreating it on my side without crossing the lines she kept insisting didn't exist. It happened naturally through work, through a project that required collaboration with someone I'd always noticed but never lingered on, a woman who carried herself with an ease that made rooms feel steadier when she entered, attractive in a way that wasn't loud but unmistakable, the kind of beauty that doesn't ask permission. Our conversations started professionally, then widened into humor, into shared irritation about deadlines and expectations, and when we talked, I noticed how present she was, how she listened without scanning the room, how her attention didn't feel borrowed from somewhere else. There was a soft hum of attraction there, undeniable but contained, a tension that lived in the space between us when we laughed too long or held eye contact a beat past polite, and I made a deliberate choice to let it exist without acting on it, because the point wasn't sex, it was symmetry, and restraint gave it weight. I mentioned her casually one evening while making dinner, not as an announcement but as an aside, saying something like, "I was talking with her after work today and lost track of time." And the way my partner's head lifted just slightly told me more than any argument ever had. She smiled, asked a few questions that sounded curious but felt like inventory, and I answered honestly without volunteering anything extra, watching the subtle shift as she realized this wasn't hypothetical, that this woman had a face, a voice, a presence that existed outside her control. When she said, with a lightness that didn't quite land, "It's nice you have someone too. I always say it's healthy." I felt the balance tip, because now her words were echoing back to her, and echoes always sound different when you're the one hearing them. Over the next weeks, I didn't hide the friendship or showcase it. I just let it be visible, letting my phone light up on the table without flinching, stepping out to take calls without apologizing. And I felt a quiet satisfaction not because I was hurting her, but because I was no longer shrinking myself to fit a narrative that didn't include me. The tension between my new friend and me stayed just that, tension, a charged awareness that made conversations warmer and silences thicker. And when she once said softly, during a late conversation that stretched longer than it should have, that she appreciated how careful I was with boundaries, I understood that power isn't in taking what you're allowed, but in choosing what you don't take. And for the first time in months, I felt steady, not because I was winning, but because I'd finally stopped playing defense. She laughed when I first mentioned her, and the laugh was real enough that for a moment I wondered if I'd imagined the shift I felt, because it came out light and airy, paired with a casual, "That's good. I'm glad you're making friends," delivered with the same tone she used when talking about co-workers. She didn't consider real competition, and she even teased me gently about how serious I sounded describing a simple conversation. But there was a fraction of a second after the laugh where her eyes stayed on my face a little too long, like she was checking for something, measuring how much of myself I was revealing. I didn't fill the space, didn't rush to reassure her, just kept cooking while I told her about my day, about how we'd ended up talking longer than planned, about how easy it was to lose track of time when conversation flowed without effort, and I could feel the atmosphere in the room adjust, subtle but undeniable, because ease is threatening when it's not yours to control. She asked what she was like, and the question was framed as curiosity, but carried an edge I hadn't heard before. So I described her honestly, not embellishing but not diminishing either, mentioning her confidence, the way she listened, the fact that she was attractive in a way people noticed without her having to work for it. And as the words left my mouth, I watched my partner's posture stiffen just slightly, her smile tightening as she stirred her drink with unnecessary focus. Over the next few days, the shift became harder to ignore because suddenly my phone lighting up wasn't background noise but something she tracked with her eyes. And when I stepped into another room to take a call, she followed a few minutes later under the pretense of needing something, her questions growing more detailed, more frequent, until one night she asked, with a brightness that didn't quite reach her voice, "So, do you talk to her a lot now?" And when I answered calmly that we talked when it made sense, the same way she talked to her friend, she frowned and said, "I just don't want things to get confusing." And I had to fight the urge to smile at the irony. The rules she'd defended so confidently began to wobble under their own weight, because now trust wasn't theoretical anymore. It wasn't a concept she could explain away with principles. It was embodied in a woman she hadn't chosen, whose name she couldn't dismiss. And when she tried to backtrack by suggesting that maybe some boundaries were worth discussing after all, I reminded her gently, using her own words, that guys and girls could just be friends, and that it felt unfair to suddenly apply scrutiny where none had been required before. The conversation stretched late into the night, her voice growing sharper as she insisted this was different, that she could feel something was off, and me responding evenly that feelings weren't evidence, that discomfort didn't mean wrongdoing, and watching the realization dawn that the logic she'd used to dismiss me now left her nowhere to stand. In that moment, I saw the first real crack, not dramatic or explosive, but hairline and spreading, because equality only feels comfortable when you're the one benefiting from it. And as she lay awake beside me afterward, restless and quiet, I understood that the balance had shifted, not because I'd taken anything from her, but because I'd stopped giving something away. I didn't expect the truth to arrive gently, because nothing else had, but it did, sliding into an ordinary moment when my guard was down, which somehow made it worse, because revelations always cut deeper when you're not braced for them. We were sitting across from each other after work, the kind of lingering coffee that stretches into evening without intention, the air between us warm with that familiar tension that never quite tipped into action, and she was telling me a story about a disastrous date she'd once had when she paused, studying my face with a look that was too careful to be casual. She asked, slowly, whether my girlfriend's male best friend had ever dated seriously, and the way she asked it felt weighted, like she already knew the answer and needed me to say it out loud, and when I shrugged and said I wasn't sure, that he'd always been framed as harmless and permanent, she exhaled in a way that sounded like recognition rather than surprise. She didn't rush into it, didn't dramatize, just told me that she'd been there before, that she'd once believed the same reassurances, that the man my girlfriend insisted was platonic had said identical things to her, used the same language about emotional safety and boundaries while slowly blurring them until the line between friendship and something else dissolved quietly enough to deny later. She told me they'd slept together eventually, not in some reckless or passionate explosion, but in the slow, inevitable way that comes when two people treat each other like primary emotional partners while insisting they're not. And she said it without bitterness, without trying to shock me, which somehow made it land heavier. She explained that she hadn't sought me out by coincidence, that when she recognized the dynamic she'd felt an uncomfortable sense of déjà vu, and instead of stepping away she'd stayed close, curious to see whether I would contort myself the way she once had, or whether I'd noticed the pattern before it finished repeating. As she spoke, I felt a strange mix of heat and clarity, because there was something intimate about the way she trusted me with this, about the shared understanding humming beneath her words, and the attraction that had simmered quietly between us, sharpened into something more electric. Not because she was offering herself, but because she was offering context, and context is power. I asked her why she was telling me now, and she met my eyes steadily, telling me that timing mattered, that people only hear the truth when they're already halfway toward it, and I realized she wasn't trying to pull me toward her, but to steady me where I stood. That night, lying beside my girlfriend as she scrolled idly through her phone, I replayed the conversation over and over, connecting dots I'd tried not to see, understanding that what I'd been told was normal wasn't unique at all, but a recycled script designed to preserve access without accountability. I watched her type, watched the faint smile touch her mouth before she caught herself, and for the first time I didn't feel confusion or jealousy, but something colder and more precise, because knowledge rearranges the emotional landscape in irreversible ways. When she noticed my quiet and asked what was wrong, her voice soft with what sounded like concern, I told her I was just tired, and it wasn't a lie so much as an incomplete truth, because I was exhausted from pretending this was all accidental. As she curled closer, her body familiar and warm, I felt the distance between us widen internally, not out of spite, but out of awareness, because once you see the cycle you can't unknow it, and the most unsettling part wasn't that she might have crossed a line before, but that she'd learned how to stand just close enough to it to keep plausible deniability intact. I didn't confront her, not yet, because confrontation would have given her the chance to pivot, to reframe, to accuse me of paranoia or insecurity, and instead I let the knowledge settle, let it inform the way I listened and the questions I didn't ask. I felt the balance tilt further, not because I was plotting something dramatic, but because I finally understood that this wasn't about trust or friendship or even sex, but about patterns and permission, about how some people test how much they can take without being challenged. As I drifted toward sleep, the quiet between us thick and uneasy, I knew the game had changed again, not because I was about to expose her, but because I was no longer playing blind, and that awareness, calm and unyielding, felt like the sharpest edge of all. Once I had the information, I stopped guessing and started observing, and the shift was immediate, because details that once felt ambiguous suddenly arranged themselves into a pattern so clear it was almost embarrassing I hadn't named it sooner. I watched how she talked about him, not with longing exactly, but with a practiced casualness that felt too smooth, how she minimized without denying, how every description came preloaded with justifications, and I realized this wasn't a friendship she was defending in real time, but a structure she'd defended before, refined through repetition. I noticed how quickly she referenced him when she needed validation, how his opinions appeared in our conversations as if they carried equal weight to mine, how she used phrases like, "he agrees with me," when we disagreed, and once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it, because innocence doesn't require choreography. The more I paid attention, the more obvious it became that this wasn't about one person, but about a role, about having a constant emotional backup that made her feel secure without the vulnerability of exclusivity, and the realization didn't make me angry so much as it made me precise. Instead of confronting her with accusations, I began asking specific questions at moments that couldn't be brushed off as paranoia. Not aggressive questions, but grounded ones that demanded clarity, like why he knew about our arguments before they were resolved, or why she felt comfortable sharing doubts with him that she hadn't shared with me, and each time her response shifted just enough to reveal strain. She stopped laughing things off and started explaining, her tone growing sharper, more defensive, and when explanations piled up instead of settling anything, I saw the panic underneath, the subtle scrambling of someone whose story was no longer landing the way it used to. One night, when I mentioned casually that patterns tend to repeat when they're rewarded, she froze for half a second too long before asking what I meant, and I answered calmly that I'd noticed how often she framed emotional intimacy as harmless when it benefited her, and how quickly it became complicated when the same freedom existed on my side. Her reaction wasn't outrage, but fear, because fear shows up when someone realizes plausible deniability is thinning, and as she spoke faster, insisting that this was different, that I was misreading things, that I was letting someone else get in my head, I understood that the illusion she'd relied on depended on me staying confused. The collapse wasn't dramatic, no screaming or confessions, just a slow unraveling where every reassurance sounded rehearsed and every denial arrived a beat too late, and in that space I felt something settle into me that hadn't been there before, a quiet certainty that didn't need validation. I stopped chasing reassurance, stopped trying to be understood, and that withdrawal rattled her more than any accusation could have, because when you're used to controlling the narrative, silence becomes a threat. She asked if I was pulling away, if something had changed, and I told her honestly that I was just seeing things more clearly, and the way her face tightened told me she knew exactly what I meant. In that moment, the illusion finally cracked, not because I'd exposed her to anyone else, but because I'd exposed the mechanism to myself, and once you recognize how innocence is constructed, how it's maintained through repetition and dismissal, it loses its power entirely, leaving behind nothing but the uncomfortable truth that some people don't cross lines loudly. They erase them quietly and wait to see who notices. The realization didn't come as a confession or a dramatic slip, because she was too careful for that, but it surfaced during a late argument that stretched past midnight, the kind where exhaustion loosens defenses and people say more than they intend while still believing they're in control. We were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, the air thick with unslept tension, and she was accusing me of being distant, of changing without explanation, of making her feel like she was suddenly on trial, and when I told her calmly that distance tends to appear when trust erodes, she snapped back that trust shouldn't be this fragile if what we had was real. I asked her quietly what real meant to her, and that's when something shifted in her tone, a frustration edged with something like resignation, and she said that love was supposed to be tested, that relationships weren't supposed to be comfortable all the time, that pushing boundaries was how you learned whether someone was strong enough to stay. The words hung there heavier than anything else she'd said, and when I pressed, asking her to explain what she meant by tested, she grew defensive again, claiming I was twisting her words. But the damage was already done because the idea had revealed itself. As she talked in circles, insisting she needed to know I wouldn't leave over discomfort, that jealousy proved investment, that endurance equaled devotion. I understood with a cold clarity that I hadn't been her partner so much as her measure, a way to see how much she could take without consequence, and the calm way she admitted this without ever labeling it as cruelty told me she truly believed it was normal. Once I saw it, everything snapped into place with an almost painful neatness, because the constant reframing of my discomfort, the insistence that I adapt rather than object, the way she watched my reactions more closely than my words, all of it pointed to the same truth, that she wasn't maintaining these friendships out of innocence, but out of curiosity. Curiosity about where my breaking point was and whether I'd bend far enough to reassure her without her having to give anything up. What she hadn't prepared for was my refusal to perform, because mirroring her behavior without emotion didn't make her feel secure. It made her feel replaceable, and that realization rattled her more than anger ever could. She asked if I still wanted her, if I was attracted to someone else, if she'd pushed too far. And for the first time, the questions were coming from her side, frantic and searching. And I answered honestly that attraction wasn't the issue, that respect was, and that watching her treat my tolerance like a resource she could mine indefinitely had changed the way I saw her. She cried then, not loudly, but in that quiet, controlled way that still tries to preserve dignity, telling me she hadn't meant to hurt me, that she just needed to know she mattered, and I believed her in the narrow sense that she was telling her own truth. But believing her didn't soften the impact, because needing to know you matter by destabilizing someone else isn't love. It's insecurity wearing confidence like a mask. As I sat there listening, feeling oddly calm, I realized the second twist wasn't about her intentions, but about my role. Because once you understand you were never meant to be chosen but evaluated, the desire to compete evaporates, leaving only the clarity that the test was never one you agreed to take, and that opting out was the only real power left. The shift didn't happen with a declaration or a threat, because those belong to people still trying to control outcomes. And what happened instead was quieter and far more unsettling for her, because I simply stopped reaching in ways she'd grown used to. I stopped asking for reassurance, stopped checking in about her mood, stopped filling silences with explanations meant to keep us aligned, and the absence of that labor created a vacuum she didn't know how to manage. She started texting me more during the day, long messages asking what I was thinking, whether I was okay, whether I felt distant on purpose, or if something was wrong. And I answered honestly but briefly, not coldly, just without the urgency that used to define me, and I could feel her anxiety spike through the screen. At night, she initiated conversations she'd once avoided, circling back to topics she'd dismissed when I raised them, asking how I felt about her friendships now, whether I trusted her, whether I believed she'd ever crossed a line, and I told her the truth without heat, that trust wasn't something I could force back into place just because she wanted it, that clarity changes the shape of things whether we like it or not. Meanwhile, my friendship remained exactly what it had been, visible but restrained, present without spectacle, and that steadiness became a kind of quiet contrast she couldn't ignore. We still talked, still laughed, still shared that hum of attraction that neither of us pretended wasn't there. But the restraint mattered more now than ever, because it underscored that this wasn't about revenge through sex or replacement, but about choice. There were moments when the tension felt almost unbearable, when we sat close enough that I could feel the warmth of her body, when conversations drifted into personal territory late at night, when the idea of crossing that line shimmered just within reach, and every time I chose not to, not out of loyalty to a relationship that was already dissolving, but out of respect for myself, because power isn't proven by indulgence, but by control. She noticed that too, my girlfriend. Noticed that the threat she'd imagined wasn't materializing the way she feared, and that made it worse, because now she couldn't paint herself as the victim of betrayal. She could only sit with the discomfort of realizing that what she'd normalized felt intolerable when she wasn't the one holding the advantage. She began over-explaining everything, narrating her day in excessive detail, preemptively justifying interactions I hadn't asked about, asking permission where she'd once demanded acceptance, And watching that reversal unfold was strangely sobering rather than satisfying, because it confirmed what I'd already understood, that dynamics reveal themselves not when things are equal, but when they shift. I didn't punish her with silence or withdraw affection dramatically. I just stayed honest about where I was, about the distance that had formed and why it wasn't closing on command. And that honesty unsettled her more than anger ever could have. The power shift wasn't about dominance, but about orientation, about who was centering whom. And for the first time in our relationship, I wasn't bending myself into her framework. I was standing still and letting her decide whether she could meet me there. As the days passed and her questions grew more urgent, more pleading, I felt an unexpected calm settle in. Not because I knew how it would end, but because I finally understood that whatever happened next would be based on reality rather than illusion. And that knowledge, steady and grounding, felt like the first real thing we'd shared in a long time. The breakup didn't arrive with raised voices or slammed doors, because by then, all the dramatic options had already exhausted themselves, and what was left was a quiet honesty that felt almost surgical in its precision. We sat at the small table by the window, the one where we'd once planned trips and argued about money and eaten takeout late into the night, and the light coming in made everything feel too exposed, like this was happening under interrogation lamps rather than morning sun. She kept talking at first, filling the space with explanations she'd been rehearsing for days, telling me she'd thought about everything I'd said, that she was willing to make changes, that she could pull back from friendships if that's what it took. And I listened without interrupting because it felt important to let her finish the version of the story where she still believed control could fix what clarity had already undone. When she finally paused, eyes searching my face for a reaction she could work with, I told her calmly that I believed her, that I believed she hadn't set out to hurt me, that I believed guys and girls could just be friends, and the way her shoulders relaxed for a split second told me she thought this was the turn toward reconciliation. I kept going, explaining that belief wasn't the problem, that the issue was how selectively it had been applied, how my discomfort had been framed as weakness while hers was treated as urgency, and how I'd learned something about myself through all of this, something that made it impossible to keep standing in the same place. I told her that I didn't feel chosen anymore, not because of anyone else, but because the structure of our relationship had taught me that my role was to tolerate rather than to matter, and that realization doesn't fade just because promises get better. She tried to interrupt then, her voice shaking as she insisted she could prove things would be different, that she finally understood, and I let her speak because I knew she needed to hear herself say it. But when she finished, I told her gently that understanding after the power shifts isn't the same as respect before it. There was a long silence after that, heavy and unmoving, and when she asked if there was someone else, if I was leaving her for my friend, the question carried more fear than accusation, and I answered honestly that I wasn't leaving for anyone, that I was leaving because I'd finally stopped negotiating my worth. She cried then, openly this time, asking how things could end without some clear villain, without cheating or screaming or betrayal she could point to, and I told her that sometimes endings don't need crimes, they just need clarity, and clarity is brutal because it doesn't allow for redemption arcs on demand. I packed slowly, deliberately, not as punishment, but as punctuation, and when I walked out she didn't follow or beg, just stood in the doorway watching me go with an expression that looked less like heartbreak and more like disbelief, as if she couldn't understand how something so calm could feel so final. Outside, the air felt different, lighter and colder, and as I stood there for a moment before getting into my car, I realized that the revenge wasn't dramatic or public or cruel, but exact, because I'd given her exactly what she'd insisted was normal, and in doing so, I'd exposed the one thing she hadn't planned for, which was a version of me who no longer needed to be chosen to walk away. The weeks after I left unfolded without ceremony, no dramatic messages or surprise encounters, just a slow recalibration of my days that felt strange and steady at the same time. Because when a relationship ends without chaos, there's nothing to distract you from the quiet truth of it. I moved through my routines differently, noticing how much emotional energy I suddenly had when it wasn't being spent monitoring someone else's reactions, and the absence of constant tension made ordinary moments feel almost luxurious, like breathing deeper without realizing you'd been holding your breath for years. She reached out a few times at first, not to accuse or beg, but to check in, to ask how I was adjusting, and every message carried a faint echo of the dynamic we'd shared, careful and probing, as if she was still trying to read whether the door was truly closed, and I responded politely without reopening anything, because closure isn't something you negotiate, it's something you maintain. I heard through mutual friends that she was struggling to explain the breakup, that people kept asking what went wrong, and she didn't have a clean answer that cast her as either victim or villain, and I felt an unexpected calm about that, because ambiguity is uncomfortable only when you're used to being certain of your position. My friendship remained what it had always been, present and grounded, and over time the tension softened into something warmer and more relaxed, not because it had to go somewhere, but because it no longer needed to prove anything. We talked openly about what had happened, about patterns and boundaries and how easy it is to mistake endurance for love, and there were moments when attraction flared brightly enough that it could have turned physical without much effort, moments charged with that quiet intimacy that makes choices feel heavier, and every time we paused instead of rushing forward, it reinforced something important, because restraint stopped feeling like deprivation and started feeling like alignment. Eventually, we did cross that line, slowly and intentionally, not as an act of rebellion or revenge, but as a natural extension of mutual clarity, and the sex carried none of the frantic energy I'd associated with proving something, just a grounded sense of being seen and chosen without negotiation, which was more satisfying than anything dramatic could have been. Looking back now, the revenge wasn't in replacing her or making her jealous, or even in being happy afterward, because those are all external measures that still give someone else too much power. And what actually lingered was the knowledge that I'd refused to accept a version of love that required me to shrink or endure quietly to be considered worthy. I didn't expose her publicly or confront her with receipts, because the truth didn't need witnesses. It just needed symmetry. And once she felt what she'd normalized turned back toward her, the imbalance spoke for itself. The satisfaction came slowly, in the realization that I'd stepped out of a cycle without becoming cruel or small, that I'd mirrored behavior without losing myself to it, and that the quiet ending left her with questions she had to answer alone, about why equality felt threatening only when she wasn't the one defining it. I don't tell this story because I think I won something or taught her a lesson, but because sometimes the most effective revenge isn't destruction or dominance, it's clarity, the kind that leaves you walking away intact while someone else is left standing in the space where control used to be, trying to understand how something so ordinary managed to slip through their fingers without a fight.